In today's video, we'll talk about the economic impact of fiscal deficit. Before we talk about the effects of fiscal deficit, let us quickly understand what is fiscal deficit and how is it different from national debt. Fiscal deficit occurs when the government spends more money than the tax revenue that it collects. Imagine for a given year, the government of a country collects $100 in tax revenues from its people and businesses. But for that year, the government spends $110 for various things like social security payments, subsidies, healthcare, infrastructure, defense, and so on. Then the government has incurred a fiscal deficit of $10, or rather 10% of its tax revenue. Now, if you're wondering, how can a government spend more money than it collects in taxes? Well, the answer to that is borrowing. The government borrows this additional $10 by issuing government bonds. And the government bonds are bought by its citizens, by large corporations, and by foreign governments. Now, if the government runs a fiscal deficit for a very long time, which means the government continues to spend more money than its tax revenues, the debt of the country piles up. This piled up debt results in the total national debt of the country. As you can see, the United States has been consistently running a fiscal deficit since 1970, except for a period of 4 years from 1998 to 2001. This means, on an average, United States has been spending more than its tax revenue by anywhere between 2 to 5% of its GDP. And the fiscal deficit has led to accumulation of debt from $400 billion in 1970 to $33 trillion in 2024. One important thing to note is that a fiscal deficit can also occur if tax revenues of the government drops due to either tax cuts or due to some major events like COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 pandemic was a very unique year where fiscal deficits of governments across the world increased because the tax revenues of the governments dropped as businesses were completely shut down. And at the same time, government spending on things such as COVID relief increased. As you can see on the screen, almost all countries had a fiscal deficit of more than 5% of their GDP in the year 2020. Now that we know the reason for fiscal deficit and how it adds to the national debt, let us talk about the long-term and short-term impact of fiscal deficit. My name is Kanak and welcome back to my channel. If you want to learn more about investing and economics, then subscribe to my channel, and your support is what keeps the channel running. So show your support by liking the video and dropping your thoughts in the comment section below. Now, there are two schools of thoughts about the effects of fiscal deficit. One school of thought says that having a deficit can actually help the economy grow and recover from a recession. Let me break down how spending more money can boost the economy. When the government spends money on things like building the roads, schools, or providing healthcare or social welfare, it creates jobs. Those jobs means more people have money to spend, which boosts demand for all types of goods and services. When demand goes up, businesses make more money, which helps the overall economy. Economy is like a chain. One person's spending is another person's income. And when the government increases the income of one person, it creates the flow of money within the economy. This is how government spending can boost economic growth. And especially during recessions, government spending can act as a catalyst and jumpstart the slow economy. Now, the second school of thought believes that fiscal deficit can actually have a negative impact on the economy for a few very important reasons. One big reason is something called crowding out. Think about this. When the government needs to borrow money to cover its overspending, it takes away money that could have been used by businesses and regular people. This means there is less money available for private businesses to invest. And when businesses can't invest as much, they don't create as many jobs. And when there are fewer jobs, the economy does not grow as much. So it's like a chain reaction. Government borrowing reduces private investment, which then slows down job creation and economic growth. Second important effect of high fiscal deficit is that it could lead to higher interest rates. When a government consistently spends more than its tax revenue by borrowing money, the debt piles up and the investors slowly lose confidence in the government's ability to pay back the debt. So investors demand higher interest rates. And the interest rate has an inverse correlation to economic growth. When interest rates rise, the cost of borrowing increases, which reduces private investments. This leads to slower economic growth. The third important effect of high fiscal deficit is that it could potentially lead to higher taxation or lower government spending for future generation. And let me explain this. When the government keeps spending more money than it collects in taxes, it builds up a huge national debt. If this debt keeps growing faster relative to the size of the economy, the government might struggle to pay it back. To avoid a debt default, the government might have to make some tough choices. They might have to either raise taxes so they can pay off the debt, or they might have to spend less on important stuff like social welfare or infrastructure. Politically, it's often easier for the government to spend a lot and cut taxes because people like having more money in their pockets and getting help from the government. But it is really hard for the government to take away the benefits or ask people to pay more in taxes. So running a big fiscal deficit for a long time is like passing the bill to the next generation. Think about it like this: when a country borrows too much money, it's like borrowing from the future generation. The fourth important effect of fiscal deficit could be inflation. If the government finances its fiscal deficit by printing money, it could lead to inflation because there is more money chasing a limited number of goods and services in the market. Inflation is like an indirect tax that the people pay for government's excessive spending. During COVID-19 pandemic, the United States government spent more than $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus payment, which led to a massive fiscal deficit, and that stimulus payment led to a massive inflation in the following years. So in summary, while fiscal deficit can sometimes be necessary to stimulate the economic activity during downturns or invest in long-term growth, persistent deficit without corresponding economic growth can have a negative consequence on a country's economy. Effective fiscal management is essential to balance the benefits of government spending with the potential risk associated with deficits. I hope you found this video helpful, and let me know your thoughts in the comment section below.